The theme, which we talked about at the start today, was about reflections on the past, driving future pathways. We've entitled the A.V. Hill Centennial Lecture. I'm not going to say much more beyond that. I'm going to leave that to our two very, very distinguished speakers. And we have two. You get two for the price of one tonight. Our first speaker is Dr. Nicholas Humphrey, Emeritus Professor. Interestingly, you're going to wonder, how does Nick fit in here? From the London School of Economics. Nick's background actually is very much to do with psychology, and it's to do with connection with things like religion and evolution. You're thinking, well, where does Nicholas fit in? Nicholas is the grandson of A.V. Hill, who, for many of you sitting in this room, will know about Hill from your lectures in physiology in relation to things like VO2 max and oxygen debts. Our second speaker, again, and those who are within the field of physiology, perhaps really doesn't need much of an introduction, but he deserves one, which is Professor Andy Jones, who's joining us from Exeter University. Now, Andy's background is incredible in terms of the diversity of the fields that he's worked in relation to oxygen kinetics. Many of you will follow his handle, which is Andy Beetroot, in terms of the work that he's done in terms of beetroot, his work in critical power. But really what connects Andy and all his work is endurance. He was a physiologist to Paula Radcliffe. Many of you will have seen the publications in that field. He has an extraordinary publication record, having published over 350 articles across a range of topics. He's been chief editor of Medicine, Sport and Exercise, European Journal of Sports Sciences. And Andy is going to give the major part of the talk tonight, which is about the life and the legacy of A.V. Hill. But to start with, I'd like to welcome to the floor Professor Nicholas Humphrey to very much set the background and talk a little bit about the man himself, A.V. Hill.
Let me get set up. You'll have to forgive me, I've got rather a cold. I'm going to try and wash it down with some water as we go through. But if you can't hear me, you must just tell me. I'm not sure when people first started talking about sports science, but my grandfather, A.V. Hill, whom everyone called A.V., and I'll call A.V. too, he loved sports almost as much as he loved science. At the age of 18, he was champion athlete at school, and it looks as if he pretty much won everything for that year at Blundell School. 30 years later, he could jump as well as his son David could, and he always went for a long run before breakfast every day, right up into his late 70s. And A.V. especially loved the city of Cambridge, where he was married and where he brought up his family. And he had been delighted to see how sports science has become established here at Anglia Ruskin University, which of course didn't exist when he was here. It was in the Cambridge Physiology Lab that he did his foundational work on the thermodynamics of muscular contraction, for which he won the Nobel Prize. Many years later, the Russian physicist Leon Orbeli described the atmosphere of the Cambridge lab when he visited in 1910. That's A.V. around then, 1910, on the left, and Orbeli on the right, and that's a corner of the physiology lab in 1910 or thereabouts. Orbeli wrote a memoir of it, and I'm going to read you an excerpt because it's quite fun. The English method of working is greatly different from the German. He'd just been in Germany. In England, it's absolutely necessary to drink tea at 5 o'clock. A small table was set up in the library of the laboratory, and a servant brought in a teapot with hot water, made some tea, and set out the cups. Suddenly, everyone appeared from whatever they were doing, and for 30 or 40 minutes, the whole laboratory drank tea and exchanged the latest news. Then everyone disappeared into his own corner and got back to work. going on or barely, in the laboratory, each person had his place. In truth, it was his corner. The conditions were very modest, as you can perhaps see from that picture. Gradually, I got to know people. They all came in to work just when they felt like it. A young man with a pipe appeared. "I am Hill," he said. "Would you like to see my experiments?" Hill had only just written his thesis and was a mathematician with no previous connection with biology or medicine. He was a great enthusiast for various sports, particularly running. Once, while he was running, the thought occurred to him, how does the muscle machine work? And this led him to the physiology laboratory. He invited me to see his experiments, and then he disappeared. After a bit, I asked, where has Hill got to? They said, Hill is at the instrument factory, watching the making of his galvanometer. This must have been the famous Cambridge instrument factory not far from here. A week later, they said, Hill has got his galvanometer. After this, Hill got to work. Where? In the basement. Hill shut himself up, and nobody saw him for a week. Suddenly, he finished, came out again, then all sorts of fun started up. Well, whatever he was doing with his galvanometer in the basement was clearly something special. On the back of this very early work, AV was awarded the 1922 Nobel Prize for Medicine, jointly with Otto Meyerhoff, German physiologist. Because of a delay in the nominations, the 1922 prize wasn't actually awarded until 1923. So this conference is actually occurring on the real 100th anniversary of that prize. AV got married to Margaret Keynes in 1913. She was the sister of the economist John Maynard Keynes. And he and Margaret moved to a house on Parker's Piece, just a few hundred meters from here. Some of you may know it. It's where their 4 children were born. That's my mother, Janet, sitting over on the left or to the right of her dad. Then in 1923, AV was appointed to a chair at University College, and the family moved to London. At breakfast one day in October in 1923, Margaret was reading the Times newspaper when she looked up and asked him, deadpan, who do you think's won the Nobel Prize this year? He guessed several names, but she shook her head. No, you have. AV thought she must be pulling his leg, and he set off as usual for his morning run. But 5-year-old Janet quickly caught on. When she went to school that morning, she announced triumphantly to her class that her dad had won the Derby. When AV himself got to work at UCL, there was in fact, to his surprise, a reception committee waiting for him, and the students chaired him down the steps. This is the house, here's a photo of the prize ceremony in Stockholm. I'm sorry it's a bit blurred, but it's rather charming, isn't it? Otto Meyerhoff is to there's AV in the middle. Otto Meyerhoff is to his right. And that rather supercilious man to the left is, anyone guess? The poet W.B. Yeats, who had won the prize for literature for that year. And throughout the whole ceremony, he refused to even look in the direction of A.V. Hill, who he regarded as a wicked materialist scientist who didn't appreciate the real value of life. This is the house in Highgate, where A.V. and Margaret lived for most of their married life. If it looks rather grand, it's because it's recently been given a makeover by a Russian oligarch. Here, it's how it now looks at the back. When I was a boy, I knew the smell and feel of every room in that house. I knew the lavatory with its unforgiving smell of Geisel Ermicide, and the dank basement where Grandpa kept his frogs, which is now a swimming pool. His study upstairs, that's over to the left of the building, smelt of snuff and sometimes of gunpowder after he'd shot a pigeon from the window out in the garden. I'm not sure when the institution of Sunday tea with the Hills was first established, probably back in the 1930s, but an institution it definitely became. I and my many cousins who lived locally were expected to attend every Sunday unless we had a very good excuse. The company at these teas usually spanned 3 or 4 or sometimes 4 generations, with distinguished visitors invited to sit down with whoever of the family had been assembled. There were often at least 20 guests for tea. When the main business of eating the tea and cakes was finished, we children were turned out into the garden to amuse ourselves, while the grown-ups could retire to the drawing room to talk science and politics. For us, there was a good pond to fish in for newts, an aviary of exotic budgerigars, lots of hen houses, a tennis court, and at the far end, the ditches and ancient works of what had been the Bishop of London's hunting ground. Sometimes our grandfather would lay on organized sports, archery, kite flying, long jumps, and the best sport of all, frog races. Now, I wonder how many people here know in the room would know how to organize a frog race. Well, I'll tell you in case it comes in useful sometimes, someday. You have to start with a bucket of frogs that your grandpa has brought home from the lab, as of course grandpas do. Then you and your siblings each select from what you think is the strongest frog from the bucket, and you stick a piece of paper on its back with your name on it. You happen to be an exercise scientist and know a sartorius muscle when you see one, it's going to put you at a distinct advantage. The bucket is then placed on top of the frogs in the middle of the lawn. Grandpa draws a 6-foot circle round it in white paint. The bucket is lifted and you shout like crazy at your frog to get a move on. First frog to cross the line is the winner. Some of the entertainments Grandpa devised were rather more serious. On one memorable occasion, he produced a sheep's head that Gran had acquired from the butcher. He placed it on the kitchen table and dissected it while we moved around. We all children crowded around. He carefully took apart one of the eyes and held up the lens for us to look through. I remember gazing through this jewel, out of the kitchen window, over the garden, the lawn, the swing, Gran's prized dahlias. It was a beautifully clear image, and everything was turned upside down. A.V. Hill was not your usual grandfather, as you may be gathering. What made him so caring of us kids? I wonder if it's relevant that his own father abandoned his wife and children when A.V. was just 3 years old. In an autobiographical sketch, he wrote, "A psychologist may speculate on whether any peculiarities I have shown can have been due to the lack of a father's influence. Well, I think there's no question that at some level, conscious or not, A.V. wanted to be for others the father figure he himself never had. He wanted to be playful, instructive, protective. And it didn't stop with his children and grandchildren. A.V. spread the net of fatherly affection extraordinarily widely. As I expect Andy Jones will describe in his lecture, not all of Hill's physiological discoveries have stood the test of time. But he became a scientific leader who made lasting contributions to human welfare on many other levels. In the First World War, he put physiology aside to work on anti-aircraft gunnery, recruiting the brightest mathematicians in the land, Hill's brigands they were called. And then when he foresaw, as many did not, how world events were unfolding in the 1930s, he became an outspoken opponent of German Nazism and a champion for human rights. He played a major part in setting up the Academic Assistance Council that helped Jewish scientists escape from Germany. 18 of those he helped rescue subsequently got Nobel Prizes. He used his influence to help organize the Kinder Transport that brought many Jewish children to homes in the UK. In 1935, he became a scientific advisor on defense matters to the British government. And anticipating a future war, he pushed ahead the development of radar, which turned out to be crucial in the victory of the war eventually. In 1942, he was elected as a member of parliament for Cambridge University. And in that role, he returned again and again to the question of refugees. Given the shameful attitudes of our present government, I want to quote a speech A.V. made in 1942 about the duty of the United Kingdom to open its doors to refugees from the continent, even though the Conservative Party opposed it. Among other specious arguments, the Conservatives argued that letting in more Jews would lead to increased anti-Semitism in the UK. And too many of them, people are going to start to object. Well, here's what AV said. I'll read it. Easing the sufferings and restoring the dignity of refugees is a task that common humanity requires shall be undertaken, just as it demands that the lifeboat shall go to a wreck. The UK's current treatment of the refugees is an index of our values. It's been unimaginative, sticky, suspicious, and unforthcoming. Apart from an appalling death rate due to starvation and disease, a whole generation of refugees is growing up with bodies stunted by deficiency, with minds seared by suffering, bitterness, hatred, fear, and misfortune. A permanent liability in a world which could so easily have given sufficient for all. When English Heritage put up a blue plaque on the family house in Highgate a few years ago, they had it read simply A.V. Hill, physiologist. Some of us would have liked to have it read A.V. Hill, physiologist, humanitarian, and parliamentarian. I'll stop there, and I want now to hand over to Andy Jones. It's been a great privilege to have a chance to tell you a bit of the man behind the story, and it's going to pick up with the science.
Insight, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank BASES for the invitation, the local organising committee, been doing a brilliant job, I can see, and Dan Gordon in particular for asking me to speak this evening. It's a real honour and a privilege, but it's also quite a responsibility. And I've had to, do quite a bit of research, and it's been a real lesson for me, both in the history of science, but also in exercise physiology as well. So I'm going to, you can see the title, A.V. Hill, the man, the myth, and I've deliberately emboldened the legacy, because while I'm going to certainly talk about Hill's many achievements, my main purpose, I think, is to bring us up to speed and show how many of the things that he either did or predicted are things that we continue to rely upon today. So here he is, A.V. Archibald Vivian Hill. A few kind of quite long sort of bits of text to begin with. Hill went to Trinity College, Cambridge, to study mathematics and natural sciences. So not sports science, not physiology even at that stage, but after graduating then studied physiology. And as a Trinity College research fellow from 1910, he focused on muscle and heat production. All students of drug receptor binding in pharmacology and enzyme substrate binding in biochemistry are familiar with the Hill coefficient, and that's something that he actually developed during his undergraduate studies, which Hill originally applied to the cooperative binding of oxygen molecules to hemoglobin. Hill became a Fellow of the Royal Society and received an OBE in 1918, so that wasn't a bad year. In 1920, he moved to Manchester University, and in 1923, as we've heard, relocated to UCL, where he spent the majority of the rest of his career. During World War II, again, as we've heard, A.V. Hill was a member of the War Cabinet Scientific Advisory Committee and also helped to develop radar, which actually proved to be pretty important in the war effort. A.V. was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1922. As we've heard, it actually wasn't awarded in 1920, it was for the work in 1922, but he received it in 1923. And it was for his discovery relating to the production of heat in the muscle. And Otto Fritz Meyerhoff simultaneously was awarded the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the fixed relationship between the consumption of oxygen and the metabolism of lactic acid. So collectively, Hill and Meyerhoff demonstrated the existence of two distinct metabolic pathways which supply energy for muscle contraction, i.e. aerobic and anaerobic. You know, these are terms that we know today, but actually had their first derivation, if you like, over a century ago, but also showed that those metabolic processes didn't happen in isolation, but actually could occur simultaneously. So there he is again, Nobel laureate for physiology or medicine, and but just to sort of tell you a little bit more about his personality, I think a lot of that shone through in the fascinating lecture that we've already heard. But according to a newspaper account of 1928, the convention of a dry as dust professor, well, who would call us dry as dust, I don't know, but was never shattered more completely than by Professor Hill. He is still a youngish man and has the frame and figure and complexion of a man who rarely leaves work in his garden or that of a cricketer. His hair is almost white and contrasts in an extraordinary way with the great vigour and freshness of the man. There is the famous house by now in Highgate. I looked it up. The last time it was on the property market, it was selling for 10 million quid. So it's probably worth maybe double that now, but you can see the plaque on the wall there. His home in Highgate is there. In addition to his work within the field of physiology, he was a highly respected independent MP, representing the University of Cambridge during the Second World War, and also, as we've heard, a humanitarian, and helping over 900 academics escape persecution by the Nazis. So clearly a remarkable person. According to contemporaries and some of his students, these are some of the scientific and personal traits that he had. He was noted for his ability to state a hypothesis clearly and concisely, and then his subsequent insistence on rigorous testing of that hypothesis. According to some, he liked to stick his neck out and be deliberately provocative. And his ideas weren't always right, but he didn't seem to worry too much about that. He regarded errors and challenges to the convention or to the status quo of the day to be not only inevitable, but actually to be necessary for scientific progress to occur. So I think some interesting lessons for us all. And we've heard about him entering Parliament, but the other thing that I picked up on reading about his background and his contributions was how important teamwork and collegiality was as well to him. He wasn't too competitive, trying to get all of the credit for himself, but he reached out to people, helped others, and I think, not only developed his own career that way, but certainly contributed massively to science. So you'll probably be wondering, what were the experiments that won the Nobel Prize? And we've heard it was to do with skeletal muscle thermodynamics. And essentially what he did was he used a thermopile, which is a series of temperature measuring devices essentially, and he put them alongside skeletal muscle, and you can see that here. And then this is a galvanometer. So what was happening here was turned basically into an electrical circuit, but actually then this is magnified essentially, or it's amplified in order to convert it into a trace. So he was able to test the rate of heat production in muscle, both during contraction and relaxation, and during various electrically stimulated tetanic contractions, and then recovery thereafter. Now, remember at that time, people didn't know about ATP or phosphocreatine. Lactic acid had been found apparently in the muscles of hunted deer, but people really didn't know about the substrates and the metabolites that are produced during exercise. But using very sophisticated apparatus, and I think his training, not in physiology, but in chemistry and physics may have been very important here. He was very interested in very sophisticated apparatus because he wanted to make very precise measurements. And he was able to make lots of insights and insinuations from those measurements would have proved pretty much to be true to this day. So here's the heat produced in an isolated one of those frogs that we saw on an earlier slide, an unlucky one, I guess, who didn't get to play in the garden. But here's a frog sartorius muscle during what they call an isometric tetanus. So the muscle is stimulated to contract maximally for 1.2 seconds. And what they found is that there's a large increase in the rate of heat output initially, which then fades with time. So as the muscle fatigues a little bit, you get this slightly reduced rate of heat release. But they found that this happened both in the presence and the absence of oxygen. So oxygen wasn't necessary for muscle to be able to contract and to produce heat. And of course, it's only when work is done that heat is produced. So this hinted at the existence of anaerobic metabolism. They also did studies looking at the time course of the recovery heat production after that 1.5 or so seconds of contraction. And again, you can see that in oxygen, the recovery heat is much larger than when the muscle was placed in nitrogen. Now, actually, you do get some recovery, you do get some heat production when the muscle was placed in nitrogen, and that's because anaerobic glycolysis was actually being used to resynthesize phosphocreatine. They didn't know that at the time, but that's what we now subsequently do appreciate. But when the muscle was exposed to oxygen, you find that you get a much larger heat in recovery. And what's happening then is that oxidative phosphorylation, aerobic metabolism, is resynthesizing the phosphocreatine and the ATP. So that was essentially it. But those were very, very sophisticated studies for their time. And actually, combined with what Meyerhoff was doing in Germany, it really did start to give some significant insight into how muscle produced work, produced force, and some of the energy pathways that were responsible for that work production. So that's what I'm going to do, is jump between the history and bringing us up to date with our contemporary understanding of muscle energetics. So I've got a few sort of bullet points in relation to that. This is point one. And what we'll see is that Hill was just, his contributions were multifaceted. I'm going to start by talking about energetics, but we'll move to several other contributions. But in terms of the energetics, first of all, Hill was fascinated by heat production in muscle and its intimate relation to the mechanical and chemical changes involved. So it wasn't just measuring heat, it was about what that heat production actually told us about how force was produced and how the chemical moieties that were involved actually contributed to that development of heat. And actually, the heat and the work tells you something about efficiency too. We'll come back to that. Hill believed that the energy needed for muscle contraction came directly from the breakdown of a so-called lactic acid precursor that was probably related to glycogen. Now, this was before anybody knew about the glycolytic pathway, and it was only in subsequent decades that the glycolytic pathway and the enzymes and the other intermediates involved in anaerobic glycolysis were actually discovered. But he made some fascinating insights and some predictions as to what might actually eventually pertain. Later still, Hill wrote an article called A Challenge to Biochemists, and the discovery of phosphogen compounds, in other words, ATP and phosphocreatine, occurred shortly thereafter. So Hill was actually involved in clarifying the roles of adenosine triphosphate and phosphocreatine in muscle contraction. And it was only by looking for the missing pieces in the puzzle and challenges to fellow scientists that those things were perhaps uncovered. Hill's initial work showed how the initial breakdown of these high energy phosphogens, or phosphates as we now know them, could be subsequently recovered either using aerobic metabolism when placed in oxygen, as I've shown you, or via anaerobic glycolysis when in nitrogen, therefore demonstrating the existence of the three energy pathways that we recognize today. So Hill did a lot of stuff as part of the the Nobel Prize, but actually that was just the tip of the iceberg, because what he went on to do actually was deserving probably of several more Nobel Prizes. Number two is our contemporary understanding of muscle mechanics, and there's another debt to Hill there. So what he was able to show was that within skeletal muscle you have what's called a series elastic component and a contractile component. The series elastic component shows the relationship between the extension of muscle and the amount of force it can produce. So when a muscle is stretched or lengthened, it's actually able to produce more force. But the contractile component enabled Hill to produce this curve, which is the velocity force relationship, so that we know that if you do an isometric contraction where you've got no velocity, you're able to produce your highest force. But the faster the muscle contracts, the less force it can produce. And of course, you can also then start to construct power curves too. So Hill's two-compartment model of contracting muscle, showing both the series elastic and the contractile components, meant that these force extension curves and the force velocity curves could be derived, and they define firstly the properties of the series elastic component and the properties of the contractile component. And he proposed an empirical relationship for the force velocity relationship, which is hyperbolic, that is still used to this day. And this Hill curve, interestingly, applies to single fibers and can differentiate between fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, and also whole muscles, but also living organisms. And it led to the development of force power curves and our ability to actually measure peak power in athletes and the general public. So not only energetics, but also mechanics. And as we've heard, 100 years ago, sports science didn't exist at all, but you might make the case that A.V. Hill was the very first sports scientist or very first exercise physiologist. So we've heard that he was a runner and he was deeply interested in athletic performance and was delighted when his experiments on isolated contracting muscle and simultaneous experiments in exercising humans confirmed and threw light on one another. So I think he wasn't just, interested in these mechanistic studies, important as they were. He also wanted to understand how those observations were actually applied in the field, in real life, and was interested in his own athletic performance, most probably, but the one actually benefited understanding on the other and vice versa. Interestingly, despite quite heavy skepticism at times from colleagues, Hill never doubted the importance of that particular line of work, sports physiology and athletic performance. And that's really pleasing to hear, I think. And he says this: the complaint has been made to me, why investigate athletics? Why not study the processes of industry or disease? And he had a few good answers to that. The answer is twofold. Actually ends up being fourfold, but I'll give you the first two to begin. The processes of athletics are simple and measurable and carried out to a constant degree, namely to the utmost of a man's powers, and those of industry are not. Number two, athletes themselves, being in a state of health and dynamic equilibrium, can be experimented on without danger and can repeat their performances exactly again and again. I might perhaps state a third reason and say that the study of athletes and athletics is amusing, certainly to us and sometimes, I hope, to them. Which leads to a fourth reason, perhaps the most important of all, that being amusing, it may help to bring new and enthusiastic recruits, such as yourselves, to the study of physiology, which needs every one of them, brackets, especially if they be chemists. But in terms of being the first sports scientist, this was an interesting photograph that I saw in one of the articles that I read. And what you have here is A.V. Hill testing the acceleration of sprinters when he was on a fellowship at Cornell University in 1927. So he's got these large coils of wire, and they were used to detect a magnet worn by the runner as he sprinted past them. So velocity and acceleration could be calculated by knowing the distance between the wire coils. Arguably, these were the very first timing gates. So, he wasn't just interested in endurance, he was interested in speed, power, and muscle force as well. Number three, our contemporary understanding of oxygen uptake and athletic performance, our debt to Hill. So I'm on more comfortable territory now because I'm not a muscle specialist, but I know a bit about oxygen uptake. And this is Hill's original plot. This probably isn't going to work, so I'll use the pointer. And what he's got here is a series of measurements of oxygen uptake at different running speeds. So there's the first running speed, and what he's done is collected expired air into a Douglas bag. He's used the Haldane transformation to calculate oxygen uptake. He's got them to repeat this run numerous times and measured oxygen uptake at different time points at each of those different speeds. And you can see that when the exercise starts, but this is the resting baseline here, that it doesn't reach a steady state immediately, but it climbs rather gradually until by about 2 to 3 minutes, we're reaching a steady state. Okay, so each of these little points here represents a measurement, and then they're running at a slightly higher speed and a slightly higher speed again. And we can see that taking a little bit longer, but eventually that steady state is reached. If you look at different individuals, the rate at which that steady state is attained differs quite considerably. But we've got this really high one here where the exercise VO2 above rest is about 3.75 litres per minute. So this was a maximal exercise. And what they say here is the lag in oxygen uptake at the onset of exercise results in an oxygen deficit, which we now understand, but eventually a steady state is reached in which the actual oxygen intake equals the requirement. The top curve reflects only an apparent steady state in which the maximum oxygen uptake has been reached and a continuing oxygen deficit is accumulated. So this individual has actually reached their so-called VO2 max at this point. So this is the first ever, I believe, chart showing a VO2 response curve, VO2 kinetics, in the transition from rest to exercise at a variety of different intensities. So essentially, this is the first recognition of VO2 kinetics and the so-called oxygen deficit and oxygen debt, because you can also look at what happens in recovery, of course. And Hill actually appreciated that the excess oxygen that you continue to uptake while you're recovering from exercise is actually being used oftentimes to clear lactate, to metabolize the lactate that you've accumulated, especially at higher work rates. And he knew that the oxygen debt, the recovery oxygen uptake, was larger when you'd incurred a larger oxygen deficit at the onset of exercise by running at faster speeds. And this is what Hill said in one of his articles: were it not for the fact that the body is able to take its exercise on credit, it would be impossible for a man to take anything but quite moderate exercise. So it's worth remembering, because if you relied solely on oxygen uptake, you really wouldn't be able to do very much. You have to use some other energy reserve, if you will, to buy you some time to get things kick-started until your oxygen transport and oxygen consumption actually catches up with the demand. And he says the body is capable of running up an oxygen debt, we now call that deficit, which must be repaid during the recovery process. So quite astonishing insight, given that this was about 100 years ago. Now, of course, today, we can make much more sophisticated measurements. We don't need to use Douglas bags, although it's very useful and interesting to do at times. We don't need to do a lot of those offline calculations. We have these metabolic carts now that we can purchase. We need to calibrate them carefully, and we shouldn't trust everything that they produce, but they give us, breath by breath assessments of oxygen uptake, carbon dioxide output, and so on. So, that's important. We know now that we get different oxygen uptake kinetics according to the exercise intensity domain within which you exercise. So if you're below your lactate threshold, you're in the moderate domain and you get a very rapid attainment of steady state. If you exercise in the heavy domain between your lactate threshold and critical power, and we'll come back to that, you may get a delayed steady state. You can have a slow component in the oxygen uptake kinetics. But if you exercise at a high intensity, just like Hill showed, you hit a VO2 max and you can't go any further. We know also that there is a strong relationship between the oxygen uptake during, or the on kinetics and the off kinetics. We know also that the oxygen deficit and the oxygen debt aren't necessarily always one-to-one. They may be for moderate exercise, but for higher intensities, we find that the oxygen cost in recovery is a bit larger than we might have predicted. And we think that's because muscle has generated heat and it takes a little bit extra time to cool back down again. So going back to oxygen uptake and athletic performance now. So that was the oxygen uptake kinetics, but Hill was also interested in relating this to performance. And these are some of the other graphs that he produced. Now, on this plot here, I think it's the open symbols are A.V. Hill himself, and he's got some other individuals in black. Now, what we've got here is essentially an incremental test. So rather than a step test, which I showed you on the previous slide, this is essentially incremental exercise. So the speed in meters per second is going up. We find that as the speed goes up, the oxygen uptake also goes up. But you can see here, this is A.V. Hill, look at all these dots here. There are a certain range of speeds where his VO2 does not get any higher. This is actually the first ever demonstration of a VO2 max. But that's just the VO2 relationship. There's more here too. This is the ventilation. And you can see here that ventilation isn't entirely linear. From about this point here, it's starting to become curvilinear. So arguably, this is the first demonstration, or one of the first certainly, of the so-called gas exchange threshold. And Hill actually appreciated that when lactic acid was being produced and carbon dioxide is being put out at a higher rate, that probably indicated that there was some sort of bicarbonate buffering going on. And here we have the respiratory quotient. Okay, so we know this is the relationship between VO2 and VCO2, and we know something about the substrate that's being utilized, whether it's fat or carbohydrate, or obviously some mixture of the two. So again, amazing amount of depth, and a lot of work went into constructing those curves. So again, probably that's the very first recognition of the existence of a maximal oxygen uptake, and perhaps also one of the first, at least, observations of a lactate and certainly gas exchange ventilatory threshold. Again, today, we know a bit more about VO2 max, but actually not a great deal has changed. We know now that if you do incremental exercise, if you do a ramp test, sometimes you see a plateau. and sometimes you don't. Now, if you see VO2 go up and then as work rate or speed continues to increase, you get a leveling off, then you can assume that that VO2 that you measured at the end of that test is the VO2 max. But on quite a few of the occasions, the thing is just linear and then it stops. And you don't necessarily know that that's the VO2 max, and maybe that's just the VO2 peak. And it's been recommended now that what you do instead is you do your ramp test, and then you choose a constant work rate that's a bit higher than the peak power that you reached at the end of the test, and you get the athletes or the subjects, to the participants, to do another test. And then you can actually verify whether the VO2 peak that you measured was really the max or not. So we're still continuing to have debates to this day about what is the best way to measure VO2 max. But actually Hill's approach appears to be pretty sound, so I don't think we've moved on too much from that. But Hill knew a lot more than about VO2 max than just realizing that it existed. He was interested in what made it up, you know, what were the determinants of VO2 max as well. So he says in one of his papers, in the 23 paper, in running, the oxygen requirement increases continuously as the speed increases, attaining enormous values at the highest speeds. But the actual oxygen intake or uptake reaches a maximum beyond which no effort can drive it. So that's the first sort of word description of VO2 max. And he also says, however much the speed be increased beyond this limit, no further increase in oxygen intake can occur. The heart, lungs, circulation, and the diffusion of oxygen to the active muscle fibers have attained their maximum. So again, extraordinary insight into the so-called Fick equation, where we know that the cardiac output and the arterial to venous oxygen difference is what's important in actually making up what VO2 is. And in 1924, Hill suggested that 4 factors limited VO2 max: the arterial oxygen saturation, the mixed venous saturation, so that's essentially the AvO2 difference, the oxygen capacity of the blood, essentially your hemoglobin concentration, and the circulation rate, which must mean your maximal cardiac output. So your maximal cardiac output and the oxygen capacity of your blood gives you oxygen delivery, and the other 2 give you oxygen extraction. So there's your VO2 max, and that's without being able to measure any of these things. These were all very insightful insinuations. Hill also proposed that the maximal cardiac output was an important determinant of VO2 max, and estimated that in athletes a Qmax, maximal cardiac output, of between 30 and 40 litres per minute might be possible. Indeed, that was true. Rather prophetic. In fact, I'd like to, think of Hill as the, I'll come back to that later. But he also considered a pulmonary limitation to VO2 max, but just from his own insight, he thought that the lungs actually were performing their work remarkably well, because he observed no signs of cyanosis. That's where you go a bit ashen or a bit blue. Everybody seemed to be pretty pink and purple at the end of their run. So he didn't think that the lungs weren't oxygenating the blood properly. But he did stress that arterial oxygen saturation might fall, that should say desaturation, might still be possible during maximal exercise. And again, we know that's true. Hill reasoned that the rapidity, the speed with which the red blood cell was traveling through the pulmonary capillary might limit the ability of oxygen to diffuse across. We know now from people like Jerry Dempsey's work that in fact in elite athletes, where you start to get where your maximal ventilation at the limit of tolerance is close to your maximal voluntary ventilation, and you've got a very big cardiac output, that in fact you can get arterial oxygen desaturation where you might get in like 85% rather than 98%. So again, that was prophetic as well. Not much has changed. Lots of debates, lots of review articles. What are the limitations to VO2 max? What are the determining factors? And we know now that it's the same things that A.V. Hill speculated upon 100 years ago. So certainly prophetic. And I was going to say that it reminds me a bit of Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, and sketches of helicopters which came true. But these were guesses from a century ago, and most of them are remarkably accurate. So what about contemporary understanding of oxygen uptake and athletic performance? Again, this I think is remarkable now, and this is the Da Vinci stuff. A man may fail to be a good runner by reason of a low oxygen uptake, a low maximum oxygen debt, or a high oxygen requirement. Clumsy and uneconomical movements may lead to exhaustion just as well as may an imperfect supply of oxygen. So he's saying there, he's recognizing that first of all that there's inter-individual variability in VO2 max, and there may be VO2 max per se may not always be able to predict performance. He also recognizes, by talking about the importance of a low maximum oxygen debt, that both aerobic and anaerobic metabolic factors contribute to performance. But interestingly, he also talks about inter-individual differences in the oxygen cost of submaximal exercise. So recognizes, I think for the first time, the importance of running economy. He actually measured the oxygen cost of walking and running at certain speeds, and realized also that there were certain speeds where running became more efficient than walking. And he also actually recognized that differences in economy are related to biomechanical or technical factors, not necessarily to differences in muscle efficiency per se. Also, I mean, this just goes on, but in 1927, he placed a 20-centimeter wooden model of a runner in a makeshift wind tunnel, measured aerodynamic drag, and then computed the energy required to overcome air resistance. And his values, suggesting that the oxygen cost was about an extra 3 to 4% at between 6 and 10 meters per second of running, ended up being underestimates, but he still appreciated the importance of air resistance to exercise performance, and it stimulated lots of other great scientists over the years to investigate those same concepts. So, just remarkable that he knew it wasn't just the innate physiology, it was also the interaction of the athlete with the environment. But he's also honest when he doesn't know things. So I'll just read out another quote. What happens to the body in training? I'm sorry, I do not know. Perhaps the blood supply to the active muscles becomes better. The capillaries responding more rapidly to the needs of the muscles. Perhaps more alkali is deposited in the fibers to neutralize the acid formed by exertion. More glycogen seems to be laid down in them as a store of energy. And certainly they and the nervous system which governs them learn in training to work more economically. Perhaps by training, the recovery process is accelerated, is quickened. Maybe the actual mechanical strength of the muscle fiber and its surrounding membrane is increased by training so that it can stand without injury the strains and stresses of violent effort. So he made a pretty good guess without supposedly knowing. None of this had ever been measured, and yet actually, I think we would accept that all of these things actually occur with training today. Now, the other thing that Hill did, this again, we're talking about oxygen uptake and athletic performance, which is a topic I like a lot. This is the first ever demonstration of the hyperbolic relationship between speed in different sports or activities and the time for which those speeds could be sustained. So what he's got here is world records. And on there, you've got men's swimming at the top, you've got men's running, you've got women swimming and women running. There's a few other data points on there like rowing as well. So you can see that, so this is the average speed at a very fast or short race, and then it drops down, but it's not linear, it's hyperbolic. And we know now that if you take a single individual and ask them to run at different speeds for as long as they can, you end up creating exactly the same curves. If you look at the world records of today, you end up with exactly the same curves. So what we've got there is the first recognition of the speed-time relationship, and therefore the first demonstration of what we now know as the critical speed or critical power concept. So this is what it looks like now. You can plot speed against time. The relationship is hyperbolic. We know that eventually that relationship levels off. There's an asymptote, which we call the critical speed. And at any one of these speeds above the critical speed, there's a certain finite amount of energy that is available to us that's known as the curvature constant, D prime for running, W prime for cycling and some other activities. So we know now that the critical speed represents the speed corresponding to the highest sustainable rate of oxidative metabolism and represents the threshold between steady state and non-steady state exercise intensity domains. Once again, of course, nowadays we know more about this than we did then, but we wouldn't have probably gone down this path without that first demonstration by Hill. What you can see there is 4 different high intensity work rates, power outputs being sustained to the limit of tolerance because you're above your critical power in this case, each one of these corresponds to a particular VO2 profile at the limit of tolerance. In other words, when this person becomes exhausted, they've sustained this power for as long as they possibly can and they can't go on any longer, they've actually hit their VO2 max. So whenever you reach the limit of tolerance in that severe domain above your critical power, you will always reach your VO2 max, and you will actually also have a very similar oxygen deficit. You will have used the same amount of W prime or D prime, that finite amount of chiefly anaerobic energy that you have available to you. So people like David Poole in the late 80s showed that at or just below critical power, you can get a steady state in VO2. You go just a little bit above it, VO2 doesn't stabilize despite the power being constant, and it will rise with time until the VO2 max is reached. And the fatigue happens much earlier than you might have predicted. So we have this slow component of VO2 that some of you may have heard of. And also if we look at lactate, at and just below critical power, we get a steady state. It's elevated above baseline, above resting values for sure, but over time it remains fairly constant. You go above critical power, sometimes by just a few watts, and it will continue to increase with time until at the point at which you cannot continue, it's extremely high. And my colleagues and I at Exeter have done a bunch of studies where we've examined the physiology of critical power, and you can exercise people just below it, just above it, and you get very different muscle metabolic responses to exercise. So different neuromuscular fatigue profiles, different muscle metabolic responses, different acid-base profiles, different respiratory gas exchange profiles as well. And that's whether you look at these things non-invasively using 31-phosphorus magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or if you use muscle biopsies, if you're more invasive about it, you get essentially the same profiles. So I just wanted to start to kind of bring it all together now. So I wanted to give an example of how I've used A.V. Hill's theories, data and results and predictions today. And I think this is quite a neat example. So I'll start by showing you a video.
Breaking the 2-hour marathon barrier is impossible. Everyone knows that. History knows it. Science knows it. Anyone in their right mind knows it. It's crazy. Nobody can run that fast for that long. So, we're doing it.
Yeah, any excuse to talk about breaking two for me, but it actually works really well, because when I was asked to help Nike in their quest to select runners who might be capable of running under 2 hours for the marathon, this is where I started. This is the model of Joyner, Mike Joyner from the Mayo Clinic, and it's a very famous one, physiological determinants of endurance performance, where the performance speed, and of course in this case we're not trying to beat any other competitors, there's a particular performance velocity that you need to be able to sustain to be able to run a marathon in under 2 hours. You need to be running at slightly higher than 21.1 kilometers per hour for 2 hours. So that's what you need to find. And then what you need to do is really useful model this to break down what are the physiological requirements, what are the determinants of that velocity. Now, one of the things that's really important, especially for the marathon, because we're talking about long duration endurance, obviously there's going to be a big oxidative or aerobic component. So you need a performance VO2. Your performance VO2 cannot be higher than your VO2 max. Okay, so this is what Hill was talking about. He recognized VO2 max. So we know that VO2 max plays an important role in this determinant of performance. We've got this lactate or gas exchange threshold as well. Underneath here, we've got the various constituent parts, the morphological or physiological indices or variables that help to determine these parameters that we know so well. And Hill recognized those, as I showed you in some of the quotes. There's also, of course, even in the marathon, a performance oxygen deficit. There's some anaerobic contribution that's obligatory. In that first minute or two of a marathon before your VO2 reaches its steady state, there's a small anaerobic contribution. There's more anaerobic contribution in the first minute than there is in the last minute, interestingly. But it's relatively small for the marathon, so we can more or less neglect it. And the buffering capacity is important now, and that's something, again, that Hill realised. And of course, he also recognised the importance of running economy. He spoke about type 1 and type 2 muscle fibres, and he knew all about elasticity. So Hill's name is writ large right across this model of endurance performance that we actually rely on so much. So how do we go from that model into determining sustainable marathon speed, and how does that help us select the athletes that we think might actually break 2 hours for the marathon, for example? So it turns out that the sustainable marathon speed can be given by the sustainable fraction of the VO2 max for a given duration or distance, multiplied by the VO2 max itself and divided by the running economy. So just as an example, if you had an individual whose lactate threshold was maybe 80% of their VO2 max, so they could run at 80% of their VO2 max in a steady state, and they simultaneously had a VO2 max of 80 mils per kilogram per minute. Not easy, but it's not impossible. There are quite a few elite athletes with 80 plus. 60 is a conversion factor, and they also need to have a running economy of 180 mils of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per kilometre of distance run. So if you had those three numbers, 80, 80, 180, that actually gives you 21.33 kilometers per hour. So that's above the magic 21.1, and that would predict a 158.42. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that. Actually finding someone with an 80 is not that difficult. Finding someone with a 180 is not that difficult. Finding them both in the same person is a bit more difficult. We also know nowadays that it isn't just these three things, it's also the extent to which they deteriorate over the course of a marathon. So some athletes seem to be more fatigue resistant than others. And also it doesn't have to be those three numbers. There's a variety of different combinations of those three numbers could actually give you something under 2 hours for the marathon. Anyway, the first thing we wanted to do was measure those variables, running economy, lactate threshold, VO2 max, in 16 or 17 of the world's best distance runners, and pick the best three. So here's just a few little video clips from the testing that we did with those athletes, either in my lab or in Nike's lab in the US. They're all running here, by the way, at 21 kilometers per hour, making it relatively easy. That's Zerzane Tedesse, who at that time was the world half marathon record holder. That's Eliud Kipchoge, the Olympic champion. And this is Galen Rupp, who was the best American runner at that time. Okay, so what kind of data do you get from those sorts of tests? So what we do is we start them off at about 16 or 17 kilometers per hour. We run them for about 3 minutes. We have a short break where we take a blood sample to determine lactate concentration, and then they go slightly faster, faster, faster. So 16 or 17, 1 kilometer or half a kilometer per hour increments. We're measuring respiratory gas exchange, heart rate, and lactate. This is the sort of thing that you get, and it's actually not really very different from what Hill was showing 100 years earlier. But here's a actual VO2 response profile. So this athlete started at 17 kilometers per hour. We dropped them onto the treadmill at that speed and we tracked their VO2. So here's their VO2 kinetics that you can model to give a time constant. And you can see that over the last minute and a half of this stage, he's reached a steady state. So there's the steady state, there's the VO2 dynamics, and of course there's an oxygen deficit here. We can go a little bit faster to 18, to 19, to 20. Now what you'll start to see is that the VO2 profiles start to get a little bit different. So steady state early on, but then it starts to get into more of a slow component. But you can see this individual athlete got to 22 kilometers per hour, actually wasn't very much higher than he got at 21.5. And if you plot the VO2 against speed relationship, you end up with a VO2 max. Now what you get from a test like this, which takes about 30 minutes, is oxygen cost or running economy, VO2 max, and VO2 kinetics and oxygen deficit, if you like. So the three things that Hill recognized 100 years ago as being important. We still measure those things today, and they're remarkably accurate in predicting performance in endurance events. This is what you get when you plot blood lactate against speed. Blood lactate is in red, heart rate is in blue. We can kind of pick out where these sort of thresholds are for this individual, probably his lactate threshold is at about 19.5 kilometers per hour. His lactate turn point or critical speed is perhaps around 21. So we've got this moderate domain, this heavy domain, and a severe domain. We've got heart rates and speeds that correspond to that. So the work that we did as part of Breaking 2, we wrote up as an article and published in the Journal of Applied Physiology a year or two ago. It's got quite a few citations, generated quite a bit of media interest. But I wanted to show you some of the data that we got in these athletes and talk a little bit about how it relates to what Hill might have predicted. So first of all, here's VO2 peak or VO2 max. Now remember that Hill said that there was going to be inter-individual variability, and indeed that's what we saw. So one individual had a VO2 max of about 84. Another, surprisingly, had a VO2 max of only about 62, but a big range. And on average, it was about 72 for the treadmill test, and it was about 74 for an outdoor field test that we also did. So on average, it was about 74 for the group. What we also found, though, was that the VO2 peak at the lactate turn point was remarkably high, about 92%. So not only is their VO2 max very high, if not inordinately high, but they're able to operate just under that VO2 max and be really quite comfortable. They're able to reach a steady state and not accumulate much lactate. And then here we got their oxygen cost. Again, big inter-individual variability, pretty good on the whole, about 190 mils per kilogram per kilometre. Very great inter-individual variability, as I've said, and it was only when all of those variables were entered into that equation that I showed you, that Ed Coyle suggested, was there a correlation with their previous best performances. VO2 max alone, VO2 peak threshold alone, and running economy alone did not correlate with performance. Though interestingly, VO2 kinetics did. So that oxygen deficit debt thing probably is really important even for longer events. Hill didn't know much about training, he said, but actually when he listed the things that he thought might be important, he got pretty much all of it right, didn't he? But I thought I'd show you the sort of training that these elite runners do. I hear that AV used to go for a run every morning, I think before breakfast. And what we know now is that actually there may be some metabolic advantages to doing that. The great Kenyan runners do precisely that. They want to run fairly early in the mornings before it gets too hot. And they go out before breakfast. They'll start running about 6 just as the sun's rising. And they'll run typically an hour. Sometimes they'll do a track session. They'll often do a long run on the Thursday, which could be anything from 30 kilometers or 18 or 19 miles right up to 25 miles. And on one occasion when I was there observing them train, they ran, and of course it's at high altitude, it's on these dirty, dusty roads like this, quite hilly courses. They tend to do it in full tracksuits. And on that occasion, Kipchoge ran 25 miles in 2 hours and 15 minutes. just as a training run, and then they go easy in the afternoons as well, just before closing for the day. But of course, the sorts of things that they want to develop, there are sessions they're designed to improve their VO2 max. There are sessions designed to improve their threshold, and there are sessions designed to improve their running economy. And there's a bit of anaerobic stuff in there as well. So that's what it's all to do with. Now, I mentioned that A.V. Hill put a little wooden figure in a makeshift wind tunnel because he recognised that air resistance was important. We, of course, know today things have got a bit more sophisticated, but we know also that air resistance is important. The study that I've shown you up here on the left-hand side is from a guy called Griffith Pugh, a Welsh physiologist, published in about 1970, who really just showed that the oxygen uptake, he's still calling it intake here, when you're running 1 meter behind one other runner is quite a bit less than when you run just completely solo, where you're trying to break the air resistance yourself. Now in the Breaking 2 event, we had this situation where you've got a pace car, which is telling the athletes exactly the speed that they need to race at. So they don't have to worry about pacing. They don't have to worry about, are they on course? They don't have to worry about any opponents. They just focus on running in that green box, essentially. And if they can hold that pace, they'll break 2. Now, Nike did their own wind tunnel experiments and indicated that a sort of a triangle formation or a pyramid was the way to go with that. Now, of course, we were rotating pacemakers in because there aren't many people on Earth who can run at 21.1 kilometers per hour for more than a few miles, even at the elite level. So we've got fresh legs coming in every 5K. But this is just to show you that pacing and drafting, things that Hill thought about 100 years ago, are still highly relevant to this day. Now, I put this one in just because I mentioned earlier that Hill seemed to be really interested in technology, in mechanics. And certainly there's been, I think you'd have been fascinated in the developments that we've seen in terms of shoe technology and also clothing, but the shoe in particular, because of course the Breaking 2 event in Monza in 2017 saw the launch of the Nike Vaporfly, which has pretty much revolutionized distance running performance. Since then, there's been the 1% and there's been the Alpha Fly, which is the one with the very big heel at the moment. Very, very well cushioned shoes, but with a carbon plate in as well, which seems to change your biomechanics, certainly changes your physiology, because the oxygen cost of running in this shoe compared to a standard shoe is about 4% less. So the demand is less, your economy is better, your oxygen deficit would also be smaller as well. And the speed at VO2 max, because your economy is better, is also higher. So, these are things that outside of our own physiology can actually impact our performance. The other thing I was a bit responsible for with the Nike Breaking 2 attempt was the pre and in-race nutrition. And I put it there because, A.V. Hill did mention glycogen, the importance of glycogen for the creation of lactate, but I think he recognized it as a substrate for oxidative metabolism as well. And of course, we know that there are other ergogenic aids that could be used. This chart here is from Krogan-Lindhard in about 1920, I think the paper's from about 1920 or 1922. August Krogh was a Danish physiologist who got his Nobel Prize a couple of years before A.V. did, but we still rely on this chart to this day. It shows us that when we use carbohydrate instead of fat so that we've got a higher RER, we need less energy to resynthesize a given amount of ATP. So that's why it's important to go into an event like a marathon with high glycogen stores, but also to take the opportunity to supplement, because you've only got a relatively small amount of glycogen that you can store. Use the drinks, use the feeding stations, the gels, the carbohydrate-rich drinks to top up and to maintain your blood glucose so that your muscles can use that carbohydrate, keep your RER high, keep your oxygen cost relatively low. So what happened in that Breaking 2 attempt? Now, when we started the project, the world record was 2 hours, 2 minutes and 57 seconds. On this day, which was the 6th of May 2017, Eliud Kipchoge, which was one of the athletes that we selected, of course, crossed the line in 2 hours, 0 minutes and 25 seconds. So it took more than 2.5 minutes off the existing world record. Just missed out. Now that's just 1 second per mile short of 1:59.59. But I think this was the key performance, actually, and I think it was one of the most remarkable athletic performances ever. Because I think there were some skeptics who thought maybe why would 2 hours ever be broken? I think everybody knows now that not only has it been broken, but it will be broken soon in a major big city race as well. But having run 2:00:25, it really was literally a matter of time before the 2 hour barrier was broken. And who better an individual to do it than Kipchoge himself? So 18 months later, in the Ineos 1:59 challenge in Vienna, he does it there in 1 hour, 59 minutes and 40 seconds. So a remarkable athlete, but actually some of the science that underpinned his performance and his preparation for that performance owes quite a bit to A.V. Hill and his papers 100 years earlier. So I'm just getting very close to finishing now. This is the legacy of A.V. Hill's Nobel Prize winning work on skeletal muscle. And I wanted just to show that he wasn't just a physiologist. Yes, he was a parliamentarian and a humanitarian as well, but his work impacted on lots of different branches of science. So I think the fact that he trained in mathematics was really important. Mathematics and physics applied to physiology gave birth to the discipline that we now know as biophysics. Obviously, there's the steady state and the oxygen debt and deficit and the VO2 max, everything that we've come to hold dear within exercise physiology. There's this Hill coefficient that I told you about, the binding, that impacts massively pharmacology and biochemistry. Here's the force velocity relationship. Obviously, that's muscle physiology, fundamental muscle physiology. He also spoke about muscle efficiency, knew about energy balance. This two-component model is used to this day in biomechanics. So, in terms of being multi-skilled and multi-talented, I don't think you can get much more of a better example than A.V. Hill himself. So I'm going to finish with a couple of final quotes. The first is from Bernard Katz, who was a long time, I think, friend and collaborator, possibly student of AV's. And he says this, so I think it's important just to kind of move away back from the science and just talk a little bit more about the man. So he says it was Hill's concern for others, the encouragement that he gave younger colleagues, his upright defence, not only of the cause of science, but of scientific men who had been driven from their places of work and needed help. In short, it was his devotion to such wider issues outside the boundaries of his own research, through which he exerted his most important influence on other people's lives and on the course of events. So, pretty cool guy, I think you'll admit. And because it's the BASIS student conference, I wanted to give the final word to AV, and that's on the final slide. And I think it should be something to reflect on and some inspiration for those of you that are starting now in your careers in exercise science. And he's talking about a book that he published, which was called Trails and Trials in Physiology. And he's asked to sort of expand upon what he meant in the use of that title. He says the implication of trails is obvious because sometimes a trail can be false, sometimes it's genuine. But when it comes to trials, that word is deliberately equivocal. Mostly the word relates quite simply to tests because we do trials of exercise and to experiments. But it would be a reminder also of vexations, failures and frustrations that are part of the job. How often do you waste a day or a month in fruitless experiments? How often are your facts misinterpreted or your theories found wanting? And you're lucky if you discover that for yourself before you publish it and somebody else disproves you. In undertaking difficult experiments, a few others are really much fun, better that they're difficult than easy. Such trials are inevitable, and it may be comforting for people to realise that others have experienced them too. Often I have told my young friends that when they have found something they cannot understand at all, instead of being cast down, they should jump in the air for joy. For that is how discoveries are made. Research must indeed be planned, but the most interesting things can emerge when the plan does not work, providing a test not only of tenacity, but of understanding. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. That was fantastic. Questions. If we can put your hands up whenever you're ready to ask a question, and just wait for a microphone to be handed to you. So would anyone like to open? Yes.
I was fascinated by the idea of it. Does it work and it does work?
It does work. There were lots of studies done sort of really through the 40s, 50s and 60s, people different sort of experimenting with different types of training. That was mainly through coaches and athletes. So again, we got this interesting relationship between what we know works, because that's what's already practiced by athletes and coaches via trial and error. And often it's the scientists that then show why it works rather than we show why something might work and then the athletes adopt it. But it does work, and there's lots of different reasons why it might. There's a suggestion that when when you're working hard, your heart rate goes up, your cardiac output goes up, your stroke volume gets larger. When you recover, you're still getting quite a lot of blood come through the heart, so you could stretch the left ventricle. That was one thing. So you could increase your stroke volume, because cardiac output is a product of your heart rate and your stroke volume, then that could improve things that way. We also know, though, that you're stimulating massively oxidative metabolism within the muscle cell. So the enzymes that are responsible for aerobic energy generation probably are getting a pretty good workout there and are likely to increase their levels of activity. The other good thing about interval training is that you've got a blend of aerobic and anaerobic, because you're switching, your VO2 recovers and then it goes back up again. So you've got this oxygen deficit debt relationship. So you're probably also, you're driving PCR quite low. So you're trying to develop some fatigue resistance to that, but anaerobic glycolysis will be high. pH will drop in the muscle, and that may be a stimulus to to an increasing buffering capacity, for example. So you get a lot of bang for your buck. And there's been a bit of a resurgence or a renaissance lately with so-called high intensity interval training as well. So I think we always knew that it worked. Athletes always include it. I showed you the week in Kipchoge's program, and there are probably at least 2 sessions per week which are interval heavy. You might do something like 30 times 1 minute hard with 1 minute easy on one day, and you might do something like 10 times or 12 times 3.5 minutes hard with 1.5 minutes easy on another day. But it's getting the blend, and doing some continuous lower intensity and tempo intensity running is important as well. So, you know, the art of the coach is to get the right balance between the high intensity interval work and the slower, more aerobic recovery sessions.
So what do you think Emeritus would be working on? What would be something that he can understand all, that we can understand all of it? And secondly, what piece of modern equipment can most excited that he'd be able to use now?
I'll answer the first question. Would you what?
I'm not sure. I think Emeritus loved working so much. I don't think he doesn't do anything else. And it did combine his interest as a runner and as an athlete with the science and the mathematics, which was kept his brain going. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's he would have been certainly interested in all the modern DNA and genetic effects, and particularly in their relevance to this. But there's one thing I'd like to mention. Francis Crick's supervisor, Bragg, wrote to Hill about 1950, I don't know which it was, not a year or two before he discovered DNA, saying that he had this student, Crick, who he was really worried about, because Crick thought he was really much better than he was, and that somebody needed to persuade him that if he was going to hold down a career and support his wife, he must not be so ambitious, and would Hill have a word with him? Hill did have a word with him and encouraged him to do exactly what he was doing.
Be interested in fatigue. Nobody's ever quite cracked what fatigue is. Obviously, you get different types of fatigue and different types of activity. I think he actually, we were speaking beforehand, and I hadn't put it in my slides, but he kind of said something about a so-called governor, didn't he? Maybe a central. So I actually recognised that fatigue wasn't necessarily always physiological. That there might have been a break, a mental aspect to this as well. And I think in terms of technology, again, a hazard in a gas, but maybe near infrared spectroscopy, because that allows you non-invasively to interrogate the muscle for oxygenation. And he was obviously interested in oxygen deficit, oxygen death, and lactic acidosis. So to be able to measure oxygenation in real time would be cool, I think. And also some of the magnet studies that I showed you, where you can look at muscle ATP, PCR, inorganic phosphate, and pH. You know, actually without taking muscle biopsies, but every 6 seconds during exercise and recovery, you can measure these intramuscular metabolites. I think that would probably have blown his mind. Still does mine.
So I've been a big fan, and I'm a huge admirer of Kipchoge. So first of all, how's it feel to have worked with such incredible man and incredible athletes? And second of all, how does it feel to be part of the team responsible for breaking something as significant as a 2-hour marathon?
Yeah, both of those things are amazing. Obviously, if you're
a sports scientist, you probably get into it because you love either sport or science. Hopefully, a bit of both. A lot of us, I think, got into it because we like exercise or we were competitive athletes, and I used to be a bit of a runner. So when I was, and I was kind of self-coached, and so I was reading all the training manuals and all the physiology books anyway, trying to work out what the limitations were and how could I make myself faster. And then the obvious thing to study is sports science, and then I leant towards physiology. So having been a runner and having studied physiology and having worked, because I always think that doing the science is one thing, but applying it is really important as well. So, you know, I'd worked with UK Athletics for a long time, but to get the opportunity via Nike to bring all of that experience and expertise, if you like, together for that one specific target was brilliant. That was absolutely the culmination of everything for me. And Kipchoge is as wonderful a person as he appears to be. I've had a text from him this morning, actually. He's just back in Kenya, having been in Boston and then in London. So he's getting some treatment on his injury and hopes to, you know, hopefully normal service will be resumed before very long.
Thank you very much for the first speech. I have a question regarding your predicted physiology. So in predicting how do you calculate the sustainable percentage of VO2? I was wondering if this is from a lactic turn point or maximum lactic steady state, or the critical speed of some recent work showing that you can sustain a higher level of oxygen sustainable above critical speed above maximum lactic steady state.
Yeah, so it's really related to critical speed. So we did a study just looking at, because you can pull people's best times off the internet these days. If you know their best time for 1,500 meters, 3,000, 5,000, maybe 10,000, you can construct their speed time relationship and you can calculate their critical speed. So if you do that and then you look at how that relates to their best speed in their best ever marathon, you find that actually they're operating quite close to critical speeds, about 96% of their critical speed. So that's a good starting point. But I did some studies in my PhD about 30 years ago where we were looking at lactate turn point, and you find that it actually corresponds quite well to maximal metabolic steady state. So from this test that I showed you, we find where the lactate turn point is. We assume that that's similar to the critical speed, and we know that they're able to operate just underneath that. So actually, having a lactate turn point at 21 isn't going to be good enough. It needs to probably be about 22. Bearing in mind as well that your lactate turn point at the end of the race is going to be lower than it was in a fresh state at the beginning. So you have to build in that deterioration. So that's how we do it. So the best marathon athletes can operate within what we call the heavy domain. They're above their first lactate threshold, but they're below critical speed. If they were above critical speed, it just wouldn't be sustainable because nothing would stabilize. But they can certainly hold a blood lactate concentration that's higher than baseline. So you're probably in the 2 to 4 millimolar range. But that's if you're a 2 to 215 runner. If you're slower than that, then obviously the speed that you sustain starts to come away from your lactate turn point and closer to your lactate threshold. But working with these elite guys, they're just below L. But actually, what you find with those is that the whole thing gets concertinaed up. Their lactate turn point is quite close to their max, and their lactate threshold is quite close to their LTP. So you've got a pretty narrow range within which they're able to operate.
Okay, other questions?
Yes, just there. Yeah, so considering you held very physical hour record, do you think there's a limitation to what human performance can be, and if there is, where could it be within the American time?
Yeah, I think the limitations probably are the same ones. I think I would add another, I've been talking about a fourth factor, a fourth dimension, and is that resilience aspect. So it's not just about what those three numbers are on the start line. I'll give you a little story. So of the three runners that we selected, Lalisa Desisa, Eliud Kipchoge and Zirzinay Tadesse, all brilliant runners, and actually when you put their three variables into the equation, they all looked like they were capable of getting close to 2 hours. Kipchoge were, remarkable physiology. I can't tell you his numbers. I won't tell you any of their numbers, but he was obviously good enough to be selected amongst the top three, but he wasn't like way ahead of the other two. But when it comes to the marathon itself, he is way ahead of the other two. I mean, we saw something very interesting happen in London yesterday, didn't we? Or what day we are now? On Sunday morning, anyway. So that, I think there could be some interesting battles to come in the future. But Kipchoge is a remarkable marathon athlete, and I think it's not that he's psychologically tougher than anybody else, because they're all really tough. You wouldn't get to where they've got to without having that ability to be really, certainly very motivated and be able to tolerate a lot of pain. So I think it's a physiological factor, and I think it's simply, especially if you look at Kipchoge in Vienna when he ran the 1:59:40, his biomechanics in the last 200 meters is exactly the same as is in the first 200 meters, and he's smiling and waving and looks it looks really easy. In fact, when we got him to Exeter and gave him an honorary degree, our Vice Chancellor asked him over lunch, Elliot, just how hard was it to break 2 hours? So it was easy. So I just don't know how fast he could have run that day if he'd actually pushed, if he tried. It would have been at least a minute faster, I think. So so I think it's the same things, but my worry, if anything, is finding somebody, like you said, like Kipchoge, because they're not, they don't come around very often. So he might be a once in a generation athlete, and we might need to wait a little bit longer before people go considerably faster. But they're going to need a very high VO2 max, excellent running economy, high fractional utilization, and really good resilience as well.
Okay, final question.
Thank you, Dan. I think you did a really good job there of demonstrating just how pivotal a person Amy Hill was in exercise physiology in many of the fields. And I don't think we do a good job of celebrating the giants of our field in the same way that physicists and chemists do with theirs. So who else do you think is in our field who is of Amy Hill's stature?
I don't think anybody, you know, in terms of depth and breadth, it's really hard to compete with that, isn't it? I think, you know, Krogh did a lot of good work because, again, they were like they did lots of things really well at once. So Krogh got, you know, actually got his Nobel Prize for the transport of red blood cells through capillaries, and yet he's doing all that stuff on substrate metabolism. So, you know, that's pretty remarkable. Personal bias probably here, but I think Brian Whipp was pretty good as well. He actually developed some of the concepts that Hill started, but I think he influenced me pretty much in terms of thresholds and kinetics and all of that stuff. But there's so many people that you could, you know, people like David Kostil, Per-Olof Astrand, Bengt Saltin. You know, a lot of the Scandinavian, you know, the Danes and the Swedes, I think we've got in the 60s, they really took our field forward with a lot of invasive measurements actually. But I think there are certain limitations to that as well, but they had to be done, and we're starting to make the same measurements non-invasively now. Yeah, but we all stand on the shoulders of giants, don't we? And maybe A.V. Hill was the first.
Okay, on that note, can I just say a massive thank you very much to